This is the second lecture on histology, and today we're going to cover the rest of the tissues. We'll cover connective tissue, cover muscle tissue and nerve tissue, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about tissue regeneration and tissue repair. So this slide basically describes the functions of connective tissue. We've mentioned them briefly, but the functions are binding and support, protection, insulation, and reserve fuel sources, and for transporting substances. It also lists the four categories or classes of connective tissue. There's connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. These next two slides show a table that shows the different types of connective tissue. You see the connective tissue proper, cartilage, and the next slide shows the bone and blood. But it also subdivides them into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, and then the different connective tissues under each of those categories. This slide also lists the cells that are predominantly found in these types of connective tissue. For example, fibroblasts, fibrocytes are found in the loose connective tissue. This slide mentions the matrix, or the ground substance, which is the material in between the cells of the connective tissue. I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. And general features. So these are tables that have a lot of important information in them for you to know. This is connective tissue proper and cartilage. The next slide involves bone tissue and blood. Again, it has other information that's important to know. I'll just leave it to you to read this and study these tables and be familiar with this content. Now, the last lecture we talked about epithelial tissue, and the main function of epithelial tissue was to cover tissues or cover organs or surfaces. And to do that, epithelial tissues need to bind together. They need to form layers of cells. They're not individual cells. The cells are linked or connected and bonded to neighboring cells to form a layer or covering. Now compare that to connective tissue. Connective tissues have cells also, but the cells aren't in close contact like they are in epithelial tissue. Actually, there's extracellular material in between the cells. A lot of extracellular material in between a lot of the connective tissue. And this diagram here illustrates how that in epithelial tissue, how the cells are close together, they're tightly packed. They make a barrier or a border because they're so tightly packed together, as opposed to the connective tissue here that shows cells they're not closely connected together. There's spaces in between the cells. There's fibers in between the cells that you can see, but the cells are not tightly packed together like they are in epithelial tissue. There's some common variables that are seen in all connective tissues, and that is ground substance, fibers, and cells. So all connective tissue have these three compounds: ground substance, fibers, and cells. So what are these? What is ground substance? I mentioned before that the connective tissue has a lot of stuff in between the cells. That stuff is the ground substance. This ground substance the definition is unstructured material that fills the space between the cells and contains the fibers. Like in this slide here, the ground substance is this material between the cells. The cells are noted by the dark dots here. This is like cartilage tissue, and the area in between the tissues, between the cells, is the ground substance. Second thing connective tissue had was fibers. There's different types of fibers. There's collagen fibers, which are the strongest fibers, and they're tough. They provide a lot of strength. There's elastic fibers that are long and thin and allow for stretching and recoil. There's reticular fibers, which are short and highly branched collagenous fibers. All these are the different fibers that are seen in connective tissue. And the third thing that the connective tissue has is cells. There's certain cells that are common in connective tissue. In this slide, I talk about blast cells and site cells. And what I mean by that is blast is the suffix. So under the blast cells you see here, I have fibroblasts, I have chondroblast, and osteoblast. These blast cells are the immature form of the cell that secretes the substance that eventually becomes the ground substance. So this basically lays out the substance that's going to harden and form the ground substance between the cells. Fibroblasts secrete ground substance that are found in connective tissue proper, and they secrete fibers and the material that connects the cells in connective tissue proper. Chondro, and the prefix chondro means cartilage. Chondroblast secretes the ground substance that are found in cartilage. Osseo, the term osseo has to do with bone, and blast again is the suffix that means immature cell. These are the immature bone cells that secrete the ground substance that later hardens and become bone. Other major class of cells are the site cells. Site, by that I mean the site is the suffix of the type of cell. For example, in this example, osteocyte. We said osteoblasts are the ones that secretes the ground substance. Osteocytes are the less active blast cell that's now become a part of the matrix. It's like if the blast cells were laying down the concrete, so to speak, between the cells, and then the blast cells gets caught in the concrete and can't get out, then it becomes a site cell where it stays in a part of the matrix, and it actually helps to regulate and helps to control the functions of the matrix. There are other cells present in connective tissues: the fat cells, white blood cells, mast cells, and macrophages. And you see the function of these cells here. Just know these are found in the different various types of connective tissue. Like I said before, there's four main classes of connective tissue. There's connective tissue proper, there's cartilage, bone, and blood, and we'll look at each of these. Connective tissue proper basically is all connective tissue except for bone, cartilage, and blood. And it's divided into two categories. There's loose connective tissues and dense connective tissues. The first one we're going to look at is areolar tissue. And you see by the microscopic view of this, there's spaces between the cells. Notice the cells are not tightly packed together. There's spaces between the cells that you could easily see. So this is a loose connective tissue. And the yellow box describes some of the attributes of areolar tissue. It wraps and cushions organs, it macrophages and bacteria, it contributes to inflammation, it conveys tissue fluid, so it has several functions. But this is one of the loose connective tissue. Another loose connective tissue is adipose tissue, or fat tissue. This has a very characteristic look about it. These cells are swollen and full of lipid or fat molecules, and it has the appearance of a ring, a diamond ring. If that's the diamond and this is the ring band, it kind of has the appearance of a diamond ring. So for your exam, you'll need to be able to identify these tissues based on the microscopic appearance. The third loose connective tissue is reticular tissue. And you see the reticular tissue has these reticular fibers, these darkened fibers. They're branched, highly branched. They're not just unbranched, they have branches and they have several divisions. This type of tissue forms a soft internal skeleton of organs. It provides a framework for organ tissue to form around. And you see some of the functions here and some of the locations where this tissue is seen. That's the three loose connective tissue. Next we'll move to dense connective tissue. There's three varieties of dense connective tissue: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Here's a slide of dense regular connective tissue. Notice that the pattern is very uniform. It's not haphazard. The lines are roughly going in the same direction, kind of east to west or left to right orientation here. You can see collagen fibers in the cells. There's actually, you see the nucleus of the fibroblasts, which are the cells that produce the matrix of this connective tissue. This is the kind of tissue that's seen in specific examples of like ligaments and tendons. So it attaches muscles to bones, or muscles, and attaches bone to bone. By the way, the difference between a ligament and a tendon connects a muscle to a bone. A ligament connects bone to bone. So just so you know the difference between ligaments and tendon. Now compare that to this dense, irregular connective tissue. Notice that the fibers are haphazard. They look like they're random. They're not all going in the same direction. Certainly not all going east to west like the last slide showed. They're going in several different directions. But because they're going in different directions, the collagen fibers are not just in one orientation, but they're in multiple orientations. And that allows this tissue to withstand tension from forces pulled in many directions. It's found in skin, joint capsules, and submucosa of the digestive tract. Here's an illustration, a cartoon of where this tissue might be found in the joint capsule of the shoulder. And the final dense connective tissue is elastic tissue. Its main claim to fame is its ability to recoil after stretching. And it's full of elastic fibers, and to me that reminded me of an elastic waistband. I put that there just for comparison's sake, just to help you remember to think of elastic and stretchability when you see the elastic fibers. I move to another type of connective tissue, that's cartilage. Cartilage, the matrix from cartilage is secreted by the chondroblast, like we mentioned before. And the adult form of the cells are chondrocytes. It's important to know that cartilage is avascular. That means it doesn't have blood vessels running through the cartilage. The cartilage receives its nutrition through diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide and different minerals and different nutrients from diffusion, not through direct blood contact. 3 types of cartilage: elastic, hyaline, and fibrocartilage. And you need to know the difference between these and kind of the locations of where these cartilages are found. You know, like the hyaline cartilage is found in the tips of the long bone, the nose, the trachea, the larynx. Elastic cartilage is seen in the ears, the epiglottis. Fibrocartilage is seen in the intervertebral disc and in the knee. See some of the differences between these, the appearance of these cartilage. Hyaline cartilage has a characteristic appearance of, with the chondrocyte, or the cell that makes up the cartilage, is located in a lacunae, which is like a lacoon or surrounded by a vacuole. It looks like eyes. It looks like a pair of eyes. So I call them Google eyes. So they look like a pair of Google eyes looking at you. That's a characteristic look for hyaline cartilage. So when you see those eyes, think of cartilage. And here's elastic cartilage. You still have the eyes, have the chondrocyte in the lacuna. Now the stain is a different color here, but it's still the same characteristic. You got the round chondrocyte in the lacuna. And except this time there's a lot of elastic fibers in between, in the space in between the cells. And this makes up the elastic cartilage. The final cartilage is fibrocartilage. Again, this is a little, if you look at the chondrocytes, you see the Google eyes still here. So now this time the Google eyes are present, but there's also a lot of fibrous material in between there. This looks to me like a combination of cartilage and dense, regular connective tissue. In fact, that's very similar to what it actually is. These collagen fibers are all running in the same direction, and they provide forces and strength in that direction. This type of cartilage is used for when strength is needed in weight-bearing areas. That's why it's the kind of cartilage seen between the disc, or in the disc between the vertebrae of the spine, and also in the disc of the knee joints. So this cartilage is designed to transmit heavy weight, or the weight of the body. Next tissue we're looking at is bone. Bone is also called osseous tissue. List some of the functions of bone. A lot of this you probably are already aware of. It supports body structures. It stores fat, and blood cells are formed in the marrow of bones. Osteoblasts produce the bone matrix. Osteocytes maintain the bone matrix. Osteons are the individual structural units of the bone, and osteons look like a tree, rings of a tree trunk. Here's a picture of here's an osteon here, this round circular space here. That's one osteon. There's another osteon here. These are the structural units of the osseous bone tissue. This is a very characteristic look to it. It's easy to recognize this tissue. Now, almost the opposite extreme is from bone would be blood. Bone is very hard and tough. Blood is very liquid and fluid, but it's still a connective tissue because it meets the criteria. It has a ground substance, which in this case is plasma. The plasma is between the cells. It contains cells. There's red blood cells and white blood cells, and it contains fibers in the blood. So it has the characteristics of connective tissue. So you might not think of blood as being a connective tissue, but it does fit the criteria, and so therefore it's categorized as a connective tissue. It functions in transportation and carrying of nutrients, water, gas, and other substances. Here's a picture of the microscopic view of blood. You see the blood cells, red blood cells. This is a white blood cell here. These are platelets. And in between the blood cells is the plasma, which is the matrix or the extracellular material of blood. The third type of tissue we're talking about is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is responsible for movement. We'll look at three types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue. This is what causes voluntary movement of the limbs, bones, facial muscles. These are the voluntary muscles under conscious control. And also these are striated or banded, and by that I'll show you a picture of what I mean by striated. Here's a picture of skeletal muscle with striated. Striations are the alternating bands of dark and light bands that run through the length of the muscle. So skeletal muscle is striated and it's under voluntary control. You need to remember those characteristics. Compare that to cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is involuntary control, and that makes sense because you don't think about your heart beating, and your heart just beats. You don't have to consciously make your heart beat. It just beats whether you think about it or not, thankfully. As opposed to skeletal muscle, if you want to pick up something, you got to consciously pick it up. You got to consciously move your muscle. It doesn't just automatically move. Now, just like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle also has striations. So cardiac muscle is involuntary, and it does have striations. Here's a picture of cardiac muscle. The striations are harder to find here. It's harder to see, but they're there. You see the striations, the alternating bands of light and dark. There's a structure called intercalated discs that are connecting one cardiac muscle to the next. That's kind of the barrier border between the muscles. And the final muscle we're looking at is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is also involuntary, but it has no visible striations. And it's spindle shaped. Spindle shape, I'll show you what that is. Spindle shape means it's tapered on the ends. It's not square like the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle. It's tapered on the ends. And you see here the picture, you don't see the striations in smooth muscle. Be sure to note the function of the tissue and the location on all these tissues, not just this one, but on all these slides have the same information. They have the description, have function, and have location. So be sure to know that for each of the tissue types. I put this in just to remind you that skeletal muscle is voluntary and striated, cardiac muscle is involuntary and striated, smooth muscle is involuntary and non-striated. The final category of tissues is neurons or nerve tissue. Nerve tissue is made of two types of cells: neurons, which is the specialized nerve cell that generates and conducts nerve impulses, and there's supporting cells that protect the neurons and that support the neurons. These are called glial cells, G-L-I-A-L, glial cells. Here's a picture of neural tissue. This dark structure here is the cell body of the neuron. This is a process called axon. You see a cartoon here showing the neuron cell body and axon emanating from the cell body. That's what we have here. These little hair-like structures are axons. And in between there's all these supporting cells. These are the neuroglial cells. I'm saying glial, G-L-I-A-L, glial cells. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about different types of covering or lining membranes. So this really kind of goes back to epithelial tissue, but there's three types of membranes that we need to make a distinction between. There's cutaneous membranes, mucous membranes, and serous membranes. Cutaneous membranes is basically another name for the skin. This is the keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium attached to the connective tissue that makes up skin. We'll cover this in detail in the lecture on integumentary system. But think of cutaneous as a dry dry membrane that covers the body, basically skin. Mucous membranes are not dry; they're moist. They're full. They secrete mucus. But the thing with mucus, they line body cavities that are open to the exterior. For example, the digestive tract or the respiratory tract. The respiratory tract here is, you may have these spaces inside the lungs, but eventually they have an opening that goes out through the mouth and nose and comes in contact with the outside environment. Same with the digestive tract. The digestive tract has a cavity in the stomach, but if you go to the esophagus or down to the rectum, it opens up to the exterior. So these are mucous membranes. Mucous membranes create mucus, and mucus is used to clear these passageways. That's why when you cough, if you have a bronchitis or pneumonia, you can cough the mucus up to clear it out of your lungs. The last membrane is serous membrane. And we've talked about serous membranes before on an earlier lecture. Remember, these are found in closed ventral cavities. So like the dorsal cavity, the ventral cavity, like the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity, the mediastinal cavity, the abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity. These are all internal body cavities that are not in contact with the external environment. That's the distinction between serous membranes and mucous membranes. Remember, the serous has two layers. There's a parietal layer and a visceral layer. The parietal layer lines the internal body cavity walls, whereas the visceral layer lines the internal organs. Between these two layers, the visceral and parietal, there's a cavity that's filled with slippery fluid that allows for movement of the organs within the abdomen and pelvis and thorax, so there's not an obstruction to the movement. They can move, like when heart beats, the movement of the heart is not bound by structures nearby. It's able to slide and slip in and out through this mucus that's created. Here's a diagram cartoon that shows some of the serous membranes. Now we'll look at tissue repair. Tissue can be repaired in two different ways. When tissue is injured, tissue can either be regenerated, and that regeneration is when the same type of tissue is replaces the destroyed tissue, so the original function is destroyed. Or the tissue can be repaired by fibrosis, which is basically the replacement of normal tissue with scar tissue. In scar tissue or fibrosis, the original function is lost. It basically provides a patch to try to connect the injured regions. But the original function is not replaced with fibrosis, where it is replaced with regeneration. There are three steps to tissue regeneration and fibrosis. First of all, inflammation. After injury is obtained or cut is made, the first step is inflammation. And you can see the effects of the inflammation here. It's listed on this slide here. You can read that and see what the effects of inflammation has on the first stage. Second stage is organization. The blood clot that was formed earlier is now replaced by granulation tissue, which restores the vascular supply. Fibroblasts come in there and start producing collagen fibers and closing in the gap made by the cut or the opening. Macrophages phagocytize dead or dying cells and other debris. Epithelial cells multiply and migrate over the granulation tissue. And the final stage is regeneration and fibrosis affect a permanent repair. So the end result is a permanent repair. Now this illustrates the fact that this is the skin, and we'll discuss this on the next lecture, but the skin is basically composed of epithelial tissue over connective tissue. The epithelial tissue has a high regenerative capacity, so it regenerates itself. That's why when you scrape your skin, you have a full repair of the skin without scar. But if you have a deep cut in the skin, you have a scar because the cut involves the connective tissue down deeper. The connective tissue does not regenerate as easily as epithelial tissue does. In fact, there's some tissues that regenerate very well, and that would be epithelial tissue, bone tissue, areolar connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and blood tissue all have very good ability to regenerate themselves. Tissues with moderate regenerating capacity is smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue. And there's two types of tissue that have almost no regenerative capacity. That's cardiac muscle and nerve tissue. So when cardiac muscle is damaged by a heart attack, there's no replacement of the injured cardiac muscle with the other cardiac muscle, but it's replaced with the scar tissue. The scar tissue may not function as well as the cardiac muscle originally did, and it could lead to heart failure or difficulty with heart function. That's what this slide shows. Basically, the scar tissue that forms in organs, particularly the heart, can impair the function of the organ. That's the end of the histology lectures. Next, we'll be talking about the integumentary system.